When I walked into my barn and saw her 40-foot camper juiced up to my workshop outlet, I didn't just see a leech. I saw the moment that would ruin her entire summer vacation. And yeah, her drone hadn't even shown up yet. Viewer instantly wonders, wait, what? How do you even pull that off legally? And how does she not notice? Exactly. That's what I was wondering too, standing there in my work boots, still holding a bag of chicken feed, staring at an orange extension cord snaking across my property like it paid rent. It was a hot July afternoon, and I'd just come back from the feed store when I noticed something was off. The air conditioner in my workshop was off. So was the radio. And the welding rig. No power at all. At first, I thought maybe a fuse blew. Then I spotted the cord. It ran from my barn, across the field, through a gap in the hedge I had specifically asked the HOA not to trim, because privacy, and landed squarely in the power port of a massive white and pink monstrosity of a camper parked just behind Karen's fence line. I didn't recognize the model, but it was the kind that probably had marble countertops, a shower bigger than my actual bathroom, and enough energy draw to brown out half the block. For a moment, I honestly couldn't process it. I just stood there, mouth slightly open, trying to make sense of how someone could be so delusional, so entitled, so deeply, breathtakingly stupid. And of course, it was Karen. Let me back up. Karen is the HOA president, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, and unofficial queen of passive-aggressive behavior. She's the kind of person who writes handwritten notes to neighbors because texts feel too informal, and once tried to get my rooster banned because he crows with attitude. She lives 3 houses down, which is unfortunately close enough to hear her yappy Pomeranian bark at falling leaves, and her favorite pastime is sending out violation notices for non-regulation garden gnomes. I had managed to fly under her radar for a while. I keep my place clean. I pay my dues. I don't cause trouble. But apparently, having a functioning barn and a productive workshop was a step too far into the Wild West for her pristine suburban sensibilities. I followed the cord like it was a live wire. It was thick, thicker than anything you'd use for a weed whacker. Industrial grade. The kind electricians use on job site. I checked my meter. My usage had spiked massively in the last 24 hours. She'd been running that camper AC, fridge, and who knows what else off my barn for at least a day. And without asking. No note. No call. No knock on the door. At this point, a rational person might have stormed over and unplugged everything while screaming about theft. But I'm not a rational person when I'm insulted. I'm patient, petty, and worst of all, for Karen, I'm very, very creative. I unplugged the cord. Quietly, carefully. Then I walked inside, poured myself a cold sweet tea, and sat down at my workbench to think. Step 1 was documentation. I grabbed my phone and took photos from every angle. The cord, the outlet, the meter, the line running to her camper. Then I pulled the footage from my security camera, the one mounted above the barn door. There she was, clear as day, sneaking around the fence at dusk, checking to see if anyone was home, then plugging into my outlet like it was a public charging station at the mall. I watched that clip 3 times. Each time, I got a little calmer, a little colder. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. She'd walked past 3 warning signs, 2 fences, and a literal no trespassing notice. That made it personal. The next day, I called my buddy Trent. He's an electrician with a sense of humor as dark as mine and a deep love for harmlessly frying electronic. I need a legal way to make someone really regret using my outlet, I told him. Are we talking sparks, smoke, or full-on meltdown? Somewhere between didn't work and requires $1,500 in repairs. He laughed, then got to work. The solution was simple. A decoy outlet on the outside wall, wired with a step-up transformer that would harmlessly push too much voltage through anything dumb enough to plug in without a surge protector. Not dangerous, just extremely bad for batteries. And perfectly legal on private property, since it wouldn't hurt any of my stuff. Just theirs. Trent even threw in a hidden meter to log the usage. You know, for posterity. 3 days later, the trap was live. I didn't say a word. I just sat back, watched, and waited. Sure enough, Karen tried again. This time at night, probably hoping I hadn't noticed her little stunt the first time. I caught her on camera again, sneaking over in yoga pants and a headlamp, like she was doing spy work instead of blatant theft. She plugged in. The light on the camper's power panel came on. She gave a little nod and walked away, smug as ever. That was Thursday. On Friday, I heard the sound of a diesel engine sputtering and choking like it had swallowed a spoon. I walked out just in time to see Karen's camper getting loaded onto a tow truck. The guy driving it shook his head and said something about the battery being completely fried. Said she was lucky the alternator didn't catch fire. Her vacation to some fancy lake resort? Cancelled. I didn't say a word. Just gave a neighborly wave and went back inside. The next morning, Karen stormed over to my driveway. You know anything about why my camper won't start? She asked, arms folded, eyebrows raised, lips pursed like she sucked on a lemon. I shrugged. No idea. But hey, maybe next time ask before using someone else's electricity. It was just a cord. You weren't even using it. Neither is your camper now. She glared at me like she wanted to bite a chunk out of my face. But she couldn't prove anything. Not without admitting to trespassing and theft. So she spun on her overpriced sneakers and stomped back home. I thought that might be the end of it. But no. Karen doesn't know how to lose quietly. 2 days later, I got an official notice from the HOA. A complaint had been filed about hazardous storage practices in my barn. Paint cans, gasoline, tools left unattended. A fire risk, the notice said. Cute. What she didn't know was that I keep my barn as organized as an operating room. Everything's labeled, capped, and compliant. I even have a ventilation system that Trent helped install. So when the HOA inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, I gave him the grand tour. Let him poke around. Offered him a cold drink. He laughed when I showed him the fireproof cabinet. No violation here, he said. In fact, this might be the safest structure on the block. I smiled. Would you like a custom-forged grill plate? Stainless steel. He took one. We talked barbecue for 20 minutes. That should have been the end of it. But that same evening, I heard a new sound, one I hadn't heard before. A soft buzzing. Mechanical. Hovering. I stepped outside. And there it was. A drone. Flying low. Circling my barn. Watching. Recording. And guess whose deck it flew back to? Karen's. So, now it's my turn again. The drone hovered like it was hunting something. It circled my barn in slow, deliberate loops, occasionally dipping low enough that I could hear the little whine of its motors change pitch with altitude. I stood there under the porch light with a cup of coffee in one hand, watching it track my property like it was on a paid mission. The thing had a camera, too. I could see the blinking red light on the underbelly. That meant someone was watching the feed in real time. I followed its path with my eyes, tracing the arc from my barn roof to my workshop windows, down toward the chicken coop, and finally, back toward the neighboring yard. And just like that, it veered left, floated over the hedge, and gently descended onto Karen's second-story deck like a homing pigeon returning to base. At that point, I had 2 clear thoughts. 1. This woman really didn't learn a damn thing from the camper incident. And 2. She was now officially violating federal aviation law. A drone over someone's private property isn't just bad manners. It's surveillance. Especially one equipped with a live camera, flying low, and without the operator's license that is legally required for flights in suburban airspace. I know because I looked it up. Thoroughly. Karen had gone from an entitled freeloader to an airborne peeping Tom, and now she was dancing in territory that involved both property rights and the FAA. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a rock. I just walked back into my house, closed the door, and started making calls. My first was to a friend who works for a small regional airport a few towns over. He's in maintenance, but he knows the rules inside and out. I explained what happened, showed him the footage I captured from my security camera, and waited for his verdict. He whistled. "She's violating at least 3 drone ordinances," he said. "And if she's filming you?" "That could be wiretapping or invasion of privacy, depending on how she's using the footage." "Can I shoot it down?" He paused. "Technically, yes. You're in a rural boundary zone and it's trespassing. But make sure it's on your property when you do. And maybe have a witness." I thanked him, hung up, and got to work. The next afternoon, the drone came back. Like clockwork. This time I was ready. I had a folding chair set up near the barn, a cooler next to it, and my old 12-gauge shotgun resting casually on my lap. Everything perfectly legal. I was within my right to use it on my own land, and my property was outside the no-firearm discharge zone thanks to a loophole in the county line. The moment the drone crossed back over my fence, I stood up slowly, took aim, and fired a single shot. It exploded in midair like a plastic piñata stuffed with lithium and bad decisions. Pieces rained down across my gravel drive and onto the roof of the barn. The motor dropped near the tractor. One of the blades landed on my hood. The rest was scrap. I picked it up, gathered the fragments into a metal bucket, and marched them right into my house. Karen came storming over about 30 minutes later. She didn't knock. Just started yelling from my driveway like I was supposed to appear on command. "You shot down my drone. That was $1,000. Then maybe don't fly it over private property without permission," I said, stepping out onto the porch. "That's not illegal. Actually, it is. And I've already filed a report with the FAA. I included footage of the drone flying, photos of the crash, and screen captures of it hovering over my barn windows. If they ask nicely, I'll even send them the serial number, assuming it didn't melt." She turned a shade of red I didn't think skin could manage. Somewhere between fury and fear. "You're bluffing." "I'm not. And just so we're clear, trespassing is a state issue. Surveillance is federal. You really want to keep playing?" She didn't answer. Just turned and marched away. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly, especially when her pride was on the line. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got another letter from the HOA. This time, it accused me of creating a hostile environment, brandishing a weapon in a threatening manner, and, my favorite, disturbing the peace with excessive firearm use. I laughed out loud reading it. Then I printed out a copy of the state law that explicitly gave me the right to discharge a weapon on private rural land, highlighted it, and included a screenshot from the county zoning map that proved my parcel was within a protected zone. I stapled everything together, walked it down to the HOA office, and left it on the desk of their terrified secretary with a little sticky note that read, "Next time she flies a drone, I'm getting fireworks involved." I thought it couldn't get better than that. But the next week, I got an invitation to the HOA's quarterly open meeting. Apparently, Karen had made such a stink about my threatening behavior that the board was now involved. What she didn't know was that several of them were already sick of her. I'd had quiet chats with 2 of them over the years. One of them still remembered the time she tried to ban Halloween decorations. Another had been fined by her for parking his own RV in his own driveway for more than 48 hours. So I went to the meeting, wore my best boot, clean shirt, brought a folder labeled evidence. When Karen tried to start spinning her usual narrative, how I was a dangerous loner who didn't respect the community, I stood up, walked to the front, and calmly laid out every incident. The power theft, the trespassing, the surveillance drone, the FAA report, which I'd already filed and gotten confirmation of receipt, the screenshots, the video footage. I passed them around like handouts at a PDA meeting. The board members looked horrified, not at me, but at her. The HOA lawyer, who'd shown up to mediate, actually leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She went pale. I finished my speech by reminding everyone that all I'd ever wanted was to be left alone to weld in peace, feed my chickens, and mind my own business. One of the board members motioned to open a vote. They didn't even wait until the end of the meeting. Right there, in front of 20 other homeowners, they voted to suspend Karen as HOA president pending review. She stormed out of the room, muttering something about legal action and how this was all a setup. The meeting ended. People clapped. I even got a few fist bumps. The next morning, I noticed her camper was still in the driveway. Still unplugged. Still broken. But just when I thought things were settling down, a strange car pulled into her driveway. A guy in a hoodie and cargo shorts stepped out, carrying 2 large totes full of what looked like server equipment and tools. He looked around, nodded at her, and headed inside. 2 hours later, I saw it. Another extension cord. Trailing out from her side gate. Running along the same hedge line. And guess where it was heading? It was like déjà vu with a side of disbelief. The cord slithered along the same path as the first one, hugging the hedge, sneaking past my freshly repainted barn wall, and inching its way toward the exact outlet Karen had tapped before. Only this time, it wasn't Karen doing the dirty work. It was her cousin, apparently. The guy who had shown up with enough gear to build a mini data center. At first, I figured he was crashing at her place for a while, maybe helping with repairs on the camper or acting as tech support for her ongoing meltdown. But when I saw that cord again, stretching its way like a shameless parasite toward my workshop, I realized this wasn't just another boundary test. This was escalation. This time, though, they didn't even bother to wait until I was gone. They did it in broad daylight. I watched from the upstairs window as the cousin, let's call him Chad, because of course it was, marched across the property line with Karen standing in the background, sipping iced tea like this was a routine maintenance call. Chad glanced over his shoulder once, then plugged into my decoy outlet, the same one that fried her camper battery to oblivion not 2 weeks ago. The fact that they hadn't figured that out yet either meant they were dumber than I thought, or just determined to pretend it had never happened. I considered confronting him right then and there. But honestly, it was too perfect. This time, I didn't just have a plan, I had a performance. Earlier that week, after the whole drone debacle and Karen's embarrassing public dethroning at the HOA meeting, I'd rigged a little surprise for any future freeloaders. Using a modified power meter, an old truck horn, and a motion-triggered trail camera, I set up a rig just inside the decoy outlet. The moment anyone tried to pull power from that specific line without tripping the correct circuit breaker inside my workshop, the horn would blast like a freight train. Loud. Immediate. Impossible to ignore. And just to really drive the point home, I added a blinking red strobe light wired to the same switch. Nothing dangerous, just humiliating. So, I waited. Sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade, pretending to read while secretly watching the meter tick up. A few minutes passed. The horn didn't go off yet, they were probably just testing the connection. Then, like clockwork, I heard it. Honun, honun, honun. The kind of sound that makes dogs bark 3 streets over and birds evacuate the trees like an air raid just started. I heard a yell. Then a crash. Then Karen shrieking something about electrical sabotage, while Chad scrambled backward, tripped over the cord, and landed flat on his back in my hedges. The horn blared one last time for good measure before shutting itself off automatically. I stepped around the corner casually, pretending to be startled. Everything all right out here? Karen was already stomping toward the property line, red-faced and wild-eyed, Chad limping behind her with a broken pair of sunglasses dangling from one ear. You rigged your outlet with some kind of trap. That's illegal. Actually, it's not. It's clearly labeled as non-accessible. It's on my property. And it only activates when someone plugs into it without permission. Which, by the way, is theft. Again. Chad opened his mouth to say something but then seemed to think better of it. Karen, on the other hand, had apparently decided logic was optional today. You're just doing this to harass us. This is harassment. You mean protecting my private property from your illegal extension cords is harassment? You don't own electricity. No, but I own the outlet you keep stealing it from. Want me to call the sheriff again? I've got the footage queued up. She stormed off without another word, dragging Chad behind her by the elbow. I stood there for a minute, listening to them argue as they disappeared into her backyard. The best part? The whole neighborhood saw it. At least 2 other homeowners were standing at the edge of their driveways, pretending to water plants or check mail while watching the latest episode of Karen and the Human Boundary Test. One of them, Mr. Patel from across the street, gave me a thumbs up and went back inside smiling. But I wasn't done yet. This needed a full finish. A flourish. The next day, I dropped a package at Karen's doorstep. No name, no note, just a sealed manila envelope with a flash drive and a laminated card inside. The card read, "For educational purposes." On the flash drive? A montage I had stitched together over the last 2 weeks. Karen plugging in the camper. Karen getting caught. The drone footage. The FAA confirmation email. The footage of Chad plugging in the cord. The horn going off. Their startled reactions. All scored to elevator music. I don't know if she ever watched it, but after that day, I didn't see the cord again. I didn't hear the drone. I didn't get a single passive-aggressive HOA notice. The camper sat untouched in her driveway like a monument to poor decision-making. Chad disappeared completely, like he'd been airlifted out of the situation by shame itself. Karen stopped showing up to HOA meetings, stopped posting to the neighborhood blog, and even stopped glaring at me when she drove by. The war was over, but there was still the matter of cleanup. The HOA, now free from her rule, began rewriting some of their more ridiculous policies. They eliminated the clause about regulation garden decor. They made drone use on other properties without consent explicitly banned. And they added what one board member jokingly referred to as the Karen Clause, a new line in the charter that granted homeowners the right to install protective measures on their own property to deter repeated trespass or theft, so long as they didn't cause permanent harm. And yes, the board did send me a thank you letter. In writing. I framed it and hung it inside the barn, right above the old horn. That should have been the end of it. It really should have. But one morning, a couple weeks later, I was loading lumber into the back of my truck when I noticed something odd. A city code enforcement vehicle parked outside Karen's house. 2 men in polo shirts and clipboards were standing near the side of her house, pointing at the camper and writing things down. Another guy was measuring the fence. I didn't think much of it, maybe a zoning thing or a permit issue, until one of them walked over to me. "You the neighbor?" he asked. "Next property over," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Just doing a follow-up. Someone submitted an anonymous report about an unlicensed temporary dwelling on the premises. That camper has been plugged in before, correct?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah. More than once. But not recently." He scribbled something on his pad and nodded. "Thanks. We've had a few complaints about unregulated camping structures and utility theft in this block. Just making sure everything's on the level." I watched them walk back over to Karen's house. She came out a moment later, wearing a robe and arguing. Loudly. They didn't argue back. Just handed her a citation and walked away. She turned and looked directly at me. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't say a word. Peace, for a little while, is a suspicious thing. Especially when it comes after a war like that. For the first week after the code enforcement visit, my yard was quiet. No buzzing. No cords. No sneaky little stunts creeping over the hedge. Karen's camper sat there like a stranded whale, growing more faded by the day. The cousin never came back, her blog stayed silent, and not a single HOA complaint landed in my mailbox. I even caught myself relaxing, hammering in the workshop without checking the cameras every 5 minutes, letting the chickens wander without worrying some HOA agent would accuse them of being aggressive fowl. But in the back of my mind, I kept waiting for the next move. Because people like Karen don't just give up. They sulk. They scheme. And then they come back with something sneakier, something that makes you wonder if maybe it wasn't over after all. The first clue was a box that showed up at my gate. No postage, no return label, just a plain brown package about the size of a loaf of bread. I found it while locking up the barn one evening. It was sitting on top of my fence post, like someone had meant for me to find it, but didn't want to get too close. I checked it for wires, shook it a little, then opened it slowly. Inside was a small plastic solar panel, a coiled extension cord, and a note. Just a scribbled line on torn notebook paper that read, "Since you're so obsessed with electricity, thought I'd save you some." No signature. But I didn't need one. Karen had gone passive-aggressive again. No confrontation, just petty bait. I tossed the box in the trash, but the message was clear. She wasn't done. Not really. She was just licking her wounds and planning something new. And sure enough, 2 days later, I found the cord again. This time it wasn't connected to anything, just loosely draped along the fence line on her side, like it had, accidentally, fallen into view. The next morning it was gone. The morning after that, it was back. Back and closer. One end now resting just inches from my property marker. I didn't say anything. I didn't touch it. I just let it sit there while I cooked up my final move. Not a trap, not a horn, not even a camera trick. This time, I wanted something pettier. Something theatrical. Something that would stick in her memory every time she looked at that camper or thought about borrowing one more ounce of my electricity. I called a friend who works in custom signage. We put together a lawn sign that looked exactly like one of those historical landmark markers. Black background, gold lettering, perfect font. It read, "On this site, Karen attempted electrical theft 3 times. Federal drone surveillance followed. Camper perished. Dignity not recovered." Below that, in smaller print, "Dedicated to petty victories and the defense of personal property." I hammered it right into the ground, 10 feet from the barn wall, exactly where her cord had once been plugged in. Facing her house. It took less than an hour for her to notice. I was back in the barn when I heard the furious, sputtering voice of a woman who had completely run out of ways to regain control. Karen stood at the edge of her driveway in yoga pants and a paint-stained hoodie, flanked by 2 HOA board members who clearly did not want to be there. She was pointing at the sign, waving her arms, demanding action. They approached me together. The same HOA rep who had voted to suspend her, now looking tired enough to retire on the spot. "We just need to ask, what's with the sign?" he said carefully. "It's educational," I said. "Historical, even." Karen nearly exploded. "It's slander." "It's not slander if it's true," I replied. "Want to see the footage again? The FAA report? The power bill?" The board members exchanged a look. One of them let out a sigh so deep it could have deflated a hot air balloon. "As long as it's not on community property, and it's not using profanity," the rep finally said, "there's technically nothing in the charter that forbids it." Karen made a noise that was somewhere between a screech and a growl. She stormed off without another word. Later that week, her house went up on a real estate site. No fanfare. Just a quiet little listing that called it a peaceful suburban retreat with charming neighbors. I nearly spit out my coffee when I read that. She didn't come outside much after that. The camper got towed away sometime during the night. The lawn went unmowed for almost a week. And then, like a bad dream fading in the morning sun, she was gone. The sign stayed. A few neighbors came by to take pictures with it. One even brought me cookies. I became something of a local legend. The guy who took on Karen and lived to tell the tale. But honestly, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about becoming some petty hero or waging war with a neighborhood tyrant. It was about standing my ground. About not letting someone treat your home like it's just an extension of their entitlement. About putting a stop to the slow creep of people who think rules only apply to everyone else. And just when I thought things had gone back to normal, just when I thought I could finally breathe easy and get back to my projects in peace, I got one last surprise. A letter. Handwritten. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted, aggressive cursive, every word underlined like she was trying to make it dig into the page. It read, "You may think you won, but people like you always show their true colors eventually. Enjoy your stupid little sign. Enjoy your chickens. Just know that this isn't over." I read it 3 times. Then I burned it in the fire pit and went back to work on a new project. A wind-powered scarecrow that waves at passing cars. With a metal hand. One that I shaped into a peace sign with 2 fingers, just slightly askew. Facing her old driveway. Because some endings aren't dramatic. They're quiet. A little funny. A little pointed. Just like revenge should be.